Rome was born in blood and fire, but its survival would depend on a daring, desperate act, one that blurred the line between betrayal and destiny. Imagine this: a newborn city perched on a few hills, full of grit and promise. Rome had walls going up, a handful of shrines, and men who could swing a sword or carve a road. Yet there was a quiet, ticking problem. No women, no families, no future. Romulus, the founder, could see it as clearly as the Tiber at dawn. Without marriages, the city would fade within a single generation. All that effort, all that spirit, gone like smoke. He tried the honorable way first. Envoys walked to the neighboring towns and spoke with open hands. The message was simple: let your daughters marry our young men, and we will be kin. But the answer was a firm no. The Sabines, proud and established, looked at Rome and saw strays and strivers. Why, they asked, would their daughters join a city of wanderers? There was another layer to this. The Romans believed in a sacred boundary, the pomerium, a line you did not cross with weapons. If Rome was to bring the Sabines inside, it had to be done without a single step that broke that holiness. So Romulus came up with a plan that felt like a riddle. Invite the Sabines in peace, then hold them fast without spilling blood inside the sacred line. He announced a festival for the god Neptune, a day of games and spectacle. Music, horses, feasts, the kind of celebration that makes old rivals set down their worries and watch together. The Sabines arrived with their families. Girls wore simple garlands, boys chased one another through the dust, fathers traded news, and the new city felt almost like an old friend. Then, at a signal only the Romans understood, the mood shifted. The women were led away, not to be harmed, but to be claimed as brides. Some stories say there were promises whispered through tears. You will be honored in our homes. You will share our citizenship. Your children will be the future of this place. In a world where citizenship was rare and precious, that was no small pledge. It did not end there, of course. The Sabines were furious. Years of skirmishes followed as fathers and brothers struggled with grief and anger. The fields around Rome saw dust rise from marching feet, and the new city learned how heavy it feels to carry both hope and blame. Yet something unexpected was happening inside the Roman homes. These women, far from powerless, began shaping the life of the city. They taught their husbands songs and customs from the valleys they once called home. They prayed to familiar gods with new names. They watched their children grow, little faces that looked a bit Sabine and a bit Roman, and they felt a tug in both directions. Then came the day when the two sides faced each other for a final reckoning. Lines were drawn. The air was tense. And it was the women who stepped forward. They walked between fathers and husbands, between the past and the future, and spoke the truth no one wanted to face. If you strike now, you divide our hearts forever. If you spare us, we will build something new together. It was not a scene of triumph. It was a moment of humility and courage, the kind that requires everyone to lay down pride and listen. That choice reshaped the city. The Sabines and the Romans joined, not as conqueror and conquered, but as partners in a larger story. A Sabine, Numa Pompilius, would later become Rome's second king. Some of Rome's earliest laws and rituals carried Sabine fingerprints. Even the famous letters that stood for the Roman Senate and people would echo a union forged by a hard lesson. Survival depends on more than strength. It depends on trust, on compromise, on the ability to weave two tapestries into one. And that is why this story endures. It is not just about how a city found wives. It is about how people navigate impossible choices, how a daring plan can cross a moral line, and how those who endure its cost can still find a way to turn pain into peace. It asks questions that make us squirm a little. Was it abduction or salvation? Can a wrong choice lead to a better world? The answers are not simple. That is exactly why the story still speaks. If you love history as much as we do, and you want to keep walking through these tangled human paths of the ancient world like this video, share it with a friend who enjoys a good story, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. There are so many more moments like this waiting just beyond the next hill. You know, when people think about Rome's founding, they picture brave warriors and epic conquests. But here's something most people don't realize. Rome almost died before it even began, and it had nothing to do with enemy armies or failed battles. The problem was much more basic than that. Picture this scene from over 2,700 years ago. There's this brand new city called Rome, built on 7 hills along the Tiber River. Romulus had just finished drawing the sacred boundaries and establishing the first settlements. But as he looked around at his growing city, he noticed something that would keep any leader awake at night. Rome was full of men, but practically no women. This wasn't an accident. The early Romans were exactly what you'd expect from a frontier settlement. Runaway slaves who'd escaped their masters, exiles banished from other cities, mercenaries looking for work, and young men seeking adventure far from home. They were tough, they were skilled, and they were ready to build something magnificent. But they were also overwhelmingly male. And here's the thing about cities in the ancient world. Without women, without families, without children, a settlement would simply vanish within 1 generation. All those brave warriors would grow old and die, and Rome would become nothing more than empty buildings and forgotten dreams. Romulus understood this crisis perfectly, so he did what any reasonable leader would do first. He tried diplomacy. He sent ambassadors to all the neighboring tribes carrying formal proposals for marriage alliances. These weren't casual requests. In the ancient world, marriage between different peoples was serious business, creating bonds of friendship, trade agreements, and mutual protection. But the responses Romulus received were humiliating. Tribe after tribe turned him down. The Sabines, who were one of the most powerful and respected peoples in the region, were particularly blunt in their rejection. Their leaders basically said, "Why would we give our daughters to a bunch of vagabonds and outcasts? What kind of future could they possibly offer?" From their perspective, it made perfect sense. These tribal leaders had spent generations building their reputations and establishing their family's honor. Their daughters were precious, not just personally, but politically and economically. Marriage was how alliances were formed, how wealth was transferred, how peace was maintained between different groups. Why would they risk all of that on this upstart city filled with people of questionable background? But here's where the story gets really interesting. Romulus faced a dilemma that would have destroyed most leaders. He could accept defeat and watch his city slowly fade away. He could try to conquer these tribes by force, but that would mean endless warfare with little chance of success. Or he could find a completely different solution, one that would require careful planning and incredible audacity. Now, there's this fascinating detail about early Roman religion that most people don't know about. The Romans believed in something called the pomerium, a sacred boundary that surrounded their city. This wasn't just an invisible line on a map. It was blessed by the gods and protected by ancient rituals. According to Roman law and tradition, nobody could bring weapons across this boundary except under very specific circumstances. This religious rule actually created an opportunity. If Romulus could somehow convince the Sabines to enter Rome peacefully, without their weapons, then he might have a chance to solve his city's survival crisis. But how do you get armed warriors to voluntarily disarm themselves and walk into what could easily be a trap? The answer was brilliant in its simplicity. Throw a party. Not just any party, but a religious festival that would be too important and too appealing for the neighboring tribes to ignore. So Romulus made his move, and it was absolutely ingenious. He announced that Rome would be hosting the Consualia, a grand festival dedicated to Neptune, the god of horses and the sea. Now, this wasn't just some local celebration that only Romans would attend. Religious festivals in the ancient world were massive events that brought together people from dozens of different communities. Think about it from the Sabines' perspective. Here was an invitation to a legitimate religious ceremony, blessed by the gods and protected by sacred traditions. Refusing to attend would have been seen as deeply disrespectful, not just to Rome, but to Neptune himself. And besides, these festivals were incredible experiences. There would be horse races, athletic competitions, music, dancing, and the kind of feasting that people would talk about for years. The Sabines and other neighboring tribes accepted the invitation eagerly. After all, what could be more harmless than a religious festival? They packed up their families, including their wives and daughters, and made the journey to Rome. And here's the crucial detail that made everything possible. They left their weapons at home. You simply didn't bring swords and spears to a sacred celebration. It would have been like showing up to a wedding in full battle armor. When the festival day arrived, Rome was transformed. The city was packed with visitors from all over the region. Families spread blankets on the hillsides to watch the horse races. Children ran between the food stalls while their parents caught up with friends from other tribes. Young men competed in wrestling matches and foot races, trying to impress the young women who watched from the sidelines. For a few magical hours, it must have felt like the solution to all of Rome's problems was right there in front of them. The city was alive with laughter, music, and the kind of energy that comes when different communities come together in celebration. Romulus walked among his guests, playing the perfect host, making sure everyone felt welcome and honored. But then, at a predetermined signal, historians think it might have been when Romulus lifted his cloak or raised his hand, everything changed in an instant. Roman men throughout the crowd suddenly revealed weapons they had hidden beneath their festival clothes. But here's what's crucial to understand. They weren't drawing swords to start a battle. This wasn't a massacre. Instead, they moved with careful precision toward the young Sabine women, surrounding them before anyone could fully understand what was happening. The Sabine men, completely caught off guard and weaponless, found themselves in an impossible situation. They could see their daughters and sisters being separated from the crowd, but they had no way to fight back effectively. Some tried to rush forward with bare hands, but they were vastly outnumbered and had no weapons to match against Roman swords. In those terrifying moments, families were torn apart. Fathers watched helplessly as their daughters disappeared into groups of Roman men. Brothers tried to reach their sisters, but were held back by the sheer number of Romans surrounding them. The festival grounds, which had been filled with joy just minutes before, erupted into chaos and confusion. The Sabine men who could escape ran from the city, probably to gather weapons and reinforcements. But many of the women were already being led away to Roman homes, and there was nothing their families could do to stop it in that moment. Now, here's where the story gets really complicated, and historians still debate exactly what happened next. Some ancient sources describe this as a pure kidnapping. The women were taken against their will and forced into marriages they never wanted. But other accounts tell a very different story. According to some historians, Romulus had prepared something that would have been absolutely revolutionary for that time period. He offered these Sabine women full Roman citizenship, complete legal rights, and a level of respect and protection that was almost unheard of in the ancient world. In most societies back then, women had very few legal protections and were essentially considered property of their fathers or husbands. But Roman law, even in its earliest form, was beginning to develop some unique features. Roman wives could own property, inherit wealth, and even divorce their husbands under certain circumstances. They weren't just considered breeding stock or household servants. They were seen as partners in building Roman families and Roman society. If this version of events is true, then what happened wasn't just a kidnapping. It was also an offer of a completely different kind of life. These women were being asked to become founding mothers of a new civilization, with rights and protections that their own tribes might never have given them. But of course, we have to ask ourselves, how much choice did they really have in that moment? Even if the offer was generous, even if Roman law promised them better treatment than they might have received elsewhere, they were still separated from their families by force and presented with an ultimatum they couldn't refuse. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of these different accounts. Some women might have been genuinely terrified and resistant. Others might have been intrigued by the possibilities Romulus was offering. Still others might have found themselves caught between loyalty to their birth families and curiosity about their potential new lives. What we do know is that this single day changed the course of history. If you're fascinated by how these ancient events shape the world we live in today, and if you love diving deep into the complex human stories behind the headlines of history, then you're going to want to hear what happened next. Like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. Because the story of the Sabine women was just getting started, and the most surprising chapter was still to come. You can imagine what happened when those Sabine men made it back to their villages. The news spread like wildfire through every settlement, every family gathering, every warrior's meeting. Their daughters, their sisters, their most precious family members had been taken during what was supposed to be a sacred festival. The betrayal cut deeper than any sword wound. The Sabine elders didn't hesitate. They declared war on Rome immediately, and they weren't alone. Other tribes that had been at the festival, or who had heard about what happened, joined them. This wasn't going to be some quick raid or minor skirmish. This was a war for honor, for justice, and for the return of their women. For the next few years, the hills around Rome ran red with blood. The Sabines were fierce warriors with generations of military experience, and they fought with the fury of men defending their families. They had allies, they had weapons, and most importantly, they had a cause that every fighter understood in his bones. Rome found itself under constant siege. Fields were burned, trade routes were cut off, and Roman soldiers died defending walls that seemed to grow thinner with each attack. Romulus had solved his immediate problem. Rome now had women and the promise of future generations. But he had also created a war that threatened to destroy everything he had built. But here's where the story takes the most incredible turn, and it's something that still gives me chills when I think about it. As the months and years passed, something remarkable was happening inside Rome itself. Those Sabine women, who had been taken from their families in such traumatic circumstances, were building new lives. Some had indeed found genuine affection with their Roman husbands. Others had discovered that the promises about Roman citizenship and legal rights were real. Many had given birth to children who were both Roman and Sabine, carrying the blood of both peoples, and these women were watching their two worlds tear each other apart. Imagine being in their position. Every day they could hear the sounds of battle in the distance. They knew that their fathers and brothers were out there, fighting desperately to rescue them. But they also knew that their Roman husbands were risking their lives to defend the city that had become their new home. Their own children were growing up in the shadow of this endless war. These women found themselves living a heartbreaking contradiction. They loved their birth families, but they were also building new families. They remembered their old lives, but they were also discovering possibilities they had never imagined. Some days they probably wanted nothing more than to return home. Other days they might have realized that home itself had become a more complicated idea. Then came the day that changed everything. The Sabines, led by their king Titus Tatius, finally managed to breach Rome's defenses. They had found a way to scale the walls and get inside the city itself. After years of siege warfare, this was their moment of victory. They were finally going to rescue their women and take their revenge on Rome. The two armies formed up for what everyone expected to be the final, decisive battle. Roman soldiers stood ready to defend their city to the death. Sabine warriors prepared to reclaim their honor and their families. The moment that both sides had been fighting toward for years was finally at hand. And that's when something happened that no one saw coming. The Sabine women themselves walked onto the battlefield. Picture this scene. Hundreds of women, many carrying small children, stepping between two armies that were about to destroy each other. These weren't helpless victims waiting to be rescued. These were mothers and wives who had made one of the most courageous decisions in ancient history. They spoke to both sides, and their message was simple but devastating. If you kill them, you kill us too. These Roman men are now our husbands and the fathers of our children. But you Sabine warriors are still our fathers and our brothers. How can we choose between the people we came from and the people we've become? How can our children grow up knowing that their grandfathers killed their fathers, or that their fathers killed their grandfathers? the women made it clear that they weren't asking to be rescued anymore. They were demanding that both sides find a different solution. Some of them had indeed found happiness in Rome. Others had adapted to their new lives out of necessity. But all of them understood that continuing this war would destroy everything they cared about on both sides. The effect on both armies was immediate and profound. Sabine warriors looked at daughters they hadn't seen in years, now holding grandchildren they had never met. Roman soldiers saw their wives putting themselves in danger to protect both their old families and their new ones. The fury that had sustained years of warfare suddenly seemed pointless in the face of this human reality. According to the ancient sources, weapons were lowered, tears were shed, and instead of a final battle, both sides began the most important negotiation in Roman history. The solution they reached was something that had rarely been seen in the ancient world. A complete merger of two peoples. The Sabines didn't just make peace with Rome, they joined Rome. Titus Tatius became co-king alongside Romulus. Sabine families moved into the city and became Roman citizens. Roman and Sabine customs, laws, and religious practices were blended together. And here's the part that really shows you how deep this integration went. When Romulus died, the next king of Rome wasn't even Roman. Numa Pompilius was a Sabine, chosen specifically because he represented this new, blended identity that Rome was creating. The influence went far beyond just leadership. Sabine religious practices became part of Roman religion. Sabine legal concepts influenced Roman law. Even small details of daily life changed. The way Romans got married, the festivals they celebrated, the gods they prayed to. Some historians think that even the famous letters SPQR, which stood for the Senate and People of Rome, contained Sabine linguistic influences. What had started as one of the most controversial acts in ancient history had somehow transformed into one of the most successful cultural integrations the world had ever seen. The Sabine women, who had been taken against their will, had become the architects of a new civilization that combined the best of both worlds. This wasn't just a happy ending, it was a completely new model for how different peoples could come together. Instead of one group conquering and absorbing another, Rome and the Sabines had created something entirely new, where both cultures contributed and both benefited. And that model of integration and adaptation would become one of Rome's greatest strengths as it grew from a small city into the greatest empire the world had ever known. So here we are at the end of this incredible story, and I have to ask you the same question that historians have been wrestling with for over 2,000 years. What exactly did we just witness? Was this really an abduction, a crime that should never be forgiven or forgotten, or was it somehow a salvation? Not just for Rome, but for the Sabine women themselves and for the future of Western civilization. The honest answer is that it was probably both, and that's what makes this story so fascinating and so troubling at the same time. Let's think about what would have happened if none of this had occurred. Rome really was facing extinction. Without women, without families, without children, all those ambitious dreams of building a great city would have crumbled into dust within a single generation. The Seven Hills would have been reclaimed by nature, and Rome would have become just another forgotten settlement that archaeologists might discover centuries later. But that's not what happened. Instead, those Sabine women, through their courage, their adaptability, and their refusal to let hatred define their futures, became the founding mothers of what would eventually become the greatest empire in human history. Every Roman emperor, every Roman senator, every Roman citizen for the next 1,000 years could trace their civilization back to that moment when those women chose to build bridges instead of walls. And yet, we can't ignore the fundamental injustice of how it all began. These women didn't choose to leave their families. They didn't volunteer to become pioneers of a new civilization. They were taken, separated from everything they knew, and forced to make the best of an impossible situation. The fact that many of them eventually found happiness or fulfillment doesn't erase the trauma of how they got there. Here's what I find most remarkable about this whole story. The women themselves ultimately became the most powerful people in it. Not Romulus with his clever planning, not Titus Tatius with his righteous anger, not even the warriors on either side who fought for years over their fate. It was the Sabine women who made the final, decisive choice that shaped history. When they walked onto that battlefield, they weren't acting as victims anymore. They were acting as leaders, as diplomats, as the architects of a new kind of society. They looked at two armies ready to destroy each other and said, "No, we're going to find a better way." And incredibly, both sides listened. That moment of courage created something that had never existed before, a civilization built on the idea that different peoples could come together and create something greater than what either could achieve alone. Rome's genius wasn't just its military might or its engineering prowess. It was this ability to absorb and integrate other cultures, to turn former enemies into fellow citizens. But here's the question that really keeps me up at night. Could such a strategy ever be justified? If you knew that taking this terrible action would ultimately save thousands of lives and create one of history's greatest civilizations, would that make it acceptable? Or does the end never justify the means, no matter how remarkable the outcome? I honestly don't think there's a simple answer to that question. The Sabine women themselves seemed to reach different conclusions. Some embraced their new lives, others adapted out of necessity, and probably others never fully forgave what had been done to them. History is messy that way. Real people making impossible choices in circumstances they never asked for. What I do know is that this story teaches us something crucial about human resilience and the power of individual choice. Those women could have chosen to remain bitter, to poison their children against their Roman fathers, to sabotage the integration that was being offered to them. Instead, many of them chose to build something new. They chose to see possibility where others saw only conflict. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that desperate strategies are acceptable, but that even in the worst circumstances, people have the power to shape their own destinies and change the course of history. The Sabine women transformed a story of violence into a story of cooperation. They turned a tale of abduction into a foundation myth about the power of bringing different cultures together. The legacy of their choice echoes through centuries. Every time we see different communities coming together, every time we witness former enemies becoming partners, every time we choose cooperation over conflict, we're seeing the same spirit that those Sabine women showed on that ancient battlefield. What lessons can we draw from this ancient story that still resonate today? What does it teach us about the complex relationship between justice and survival, between individual rights and collective needs? These are questions worth pondering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. If you're fascinated by these kinds of complex historical tales, stories that challenge our assumptions and make us think differently about the past and present, then you'll definitely want to explore more of these untold stories from the ancient world. Share this story with fellow history lovers who enjoy diving deep into the human dramas behind the great events of the past. And join us for more epic journeys through the legacy of empires, where every story reveals something new about how our world came to be.